The excavator's bucket shattered through concrete on March 12, 2024, commencing what should have been a straightforward demolition of an abandoned garage in Gary, Indiana. The structure, constructed sometime during the 1940s, had remained vacant and deteriorating for more than 3 decades, and the municipal authorities had finally authorized its removal to clear space for new development projects. However, at 10:47 in the morning, when the excavator reached 11 feet beneath the original garage floor level, the operator observed something that compelled him to halt the machinery immediately. There, embedded in compacted soil and surrounded by concrete rubble, was the unmistakable silhouette of a motorcycle. And not just any motorcycle, a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead, its chrome dulled by decades underground, but its distinctive shape perfectly preserved by the very earth that had concealed it for over 70 years. Within hours, investigators would identify the motorcycle through its serial number and registration records. It belonged to Christopher Allen Jones, a Korean War veteran who had vanished without a trace from Gary, Indiana, in August 1953, along with his prized Harley-Davidson. The case had gone cold within months, relegated to the status of unsolved mystery in an era before modern forensic science, before DNA analysis, before the investigative tools that would eventually reveal the dark truth about what happened to Christopher Jones. The discovery of the buried motorcycle would reopen a 71-year-old missing persons case and uncover a story of violence, betrayal, and secrets kept by an entire generation. But it would also raise haunting questions. Why would someone go to such extreme lengths to hide a motorcycle? What else was buried in that garage? And what happened to Christopher Jones on that August night in 1953? Before we reveal the complete story of Christopher Jones and the shocking truth discovered 11 feet underground, make certain you're subscribed to our channel and activate that notification bell. This case demonstrates how even decades-old mysteries can be solved with modern technology and persistent investigation, and how the past never truly stays buried forever. This is the story of Christopher Jones, a young veteran attempting to build a life in post-war America, and the night that ended with his most prized possession buried so deep that it would take 7 decades to surface again. In August 1953, Christopher Allen Jones was 26 years old and working as a machinist at United States Steel's Gary Works, the massive steel mill that dominated the industrial landscape of Gary, Indiana. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall with dark hair, brown eyes, and the lean, strong build of someone who worked with his hands, Christopher was known in his neighborhood as a quiet, reliable young man who kept to himself, but was always willing to help a neighbor in need whenever called upon. Christopher had grown up in Gary, born in 1927 to working-class parents Walter and Dorothy Jones. His father worked at the steel mills, as did most men in Gary during that era, and Christopher had grown up expecting to follow the same path that his father had walked. He had an older sister, Margaret, who was 29 years old in 1953 and married to a factory supervisor, and a younger brother, Robert, who was 23 years old and also working at the mills. Christopher's life had been fundamentally shaped by war and its aftermath. In 1950, at age 23, he had been drafted into the United States Army and sent to fight in the Korean War. He served for 2 years, from 1950 to 1952, as part of an infantry unit that saw heavy combat and witnessed terrible things. Friends and family who knew Christopher before and after the war noted that he returned changed, quieter, more withdrawn, prone to nightmares and periods of dark mood that his family didn't have a name for in 1952, but that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite his struggles with what the war had done to him psychologically, Christopher was determined to build a good life for himself. In early 1953, shortly after returning home from military service, he had used his military pay, savings, and a veteran's loan to purchase his most prized possession, a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead motorcycle. The bike was already 5 years old when Christopher bought it, but it was in excellent condition, and he had restored it meticulously, spending every spare hour maintaining and customizing it to his exact specifications. The Harley represented freedom to Christopher in ways that few other things could. When he rode, neighbors said, he seemed like a different person, more relaxed, more like the young man he had been before Korea had changed him forever. He would take long rides through the Indiana countryside on weekends, sometimes riding for hours without any particular destination in mind. The motorcycle was more than transportation. It was therapy, escape, and the one thing in Christopher's life that made him feel truly in control of his destiny. Christopher's personality in 1953 was characterized by reliability and routine that others could depend upon. He worked the day shift at United States Steel, arriving at 7 o'clock in the morning and leaving at 3:30 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday without fail. After work, he would typically go home to the small apartment he rented on Madison Street, work on his motorcycle if the weather permitted, and spend his evenings quietly without causing any trouble. He didn't drink much, didn't socialize extensively, and seemed content with a simple, orderly life that provided stability. He had been dating a young woman named Betty Wilson since March 1953. Betty, who was 24 years old and worked as a secretary at a local insurance company, later told investigators that Christopher was a gentleman, respectful and kind, though sometimes distant and troubled by memories of the war that haunted him. They had talked about marriage, though no formal engagement had been announced to their families or friends. Betty found Christopher's dedication to his motorcycle somewhat excessive, but understood that it was important to him for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend. Christopher's relationship with his family was close, but complicated by his war experiences that created distance. His mother Dorothy worried constantly about him, noting that he had nightmares several times a week and sometimes seemed to be somewhere else, even when sitting at the family dinner table. His father Walter, a veteran of World War II himself, understood better than most what Christopher was dealing with, but subscribed to the era's belief that men should simply endure such things without complaint or seeking help. By the summer of 1953, Christopher appeared to be finding his footing in civilian life. He had been promoted to a slightly better position at the steel mill. His relationship with Betty seemed to be progressing toward a future together, and he had joined a small motorcycle club, a group of about 8 veterans who would occasionally ride together on weekends to share camaraderie. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and stability was something Christopher had learned to value above almost everything else. On the evening of August 14, 1953, Christopher finished his shift at the steel mill as usual without incident. Several co-workers saw him leave at 3:30 in the afternoon, riding his Harley-Davidson home as he did every day without exception. He was wearing his typical work clothes, denim jeans, a white t-shirt, and a leather jacket, despite the August heat that made such attire uncomfortable. He waved to his supervisor, a man named Frank Richardson, who later recalled that Christopher seemed in good spirits, perhaps even more cheerful than usual, for reasons Richardson couldn't explain. Christopher arrived at his apartment building around 3:50 in the afternoon, according to witness accounts. His landlady, Mrs. Helen Murphy, saw him park his motorcycle in the small garage behind the building and carry his lunch pail inside, as he always did. She later told police that he looked perfectly normal, perhaps a bit tired from work, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary or concerning. What happened to Christopher Jones in the hours after he arrived home would remain a mystery for 71 long years. But what is known is that sometime on the evening of August 14th, 1953, Christopher and his beloved Harley-Davidson disappeared completely from Gary, Indiana, without a trace. And the truth about that disappearance would remain buried, quite literally, until a construction crew broke through concrete on a spring morning in 2024. Christopher Jones was a young man trying to rebuild his life after the trauma of war, working hard at an honest job, loving his motorcycle with passion, and planning a future with the woman he cared about deeply. He was exactly the kind of person who should have had decades ahead of him, should have married Betty and built a family, should have raised children who would carry his name, should have grown old watching his beloved Harley become a vintage classic worth preserving. But on August 14th, 1953, Christopher's future ended abruptly and violently, and the mystery of what happened to him would haunt his family and his community for 7 long decades. The morning of August 15th, 1953, began routinely enough at the United States Steel Gary Works facility. Christopher Jones's shift was scheduled to start at 7 o'clock in the morning, and his supervisor, Frank Richardson, expected him to arrive as he always did, punctual, ready to work, reliable as clockwork, without fail. But when 7 o'clock in the morning came and went, with no sign of Christopher anywhere, Richardson began to worry about his dependable employee. In all the months Christopher had worked at the mill, he had never been late, never missed a shift without calling in advance to explain his absence. By 7:30 in the morning, Richardson had called Christopher's apartment repeatedly. The phone rang unanswered each time, creating growing concern. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Richardson sent another worker to check on Christopher at his Madison Street address, concerned that something might be wrong. Perhaps Christopher had fallen ill, or had been injured somehow. When the co-worker arrived at Christopher's apartment, building at 8:15 in the morning, he found the landlady, Mrs. Helen Murphy, already worried about her reliable tenant. She explained that she hadn't heard Christopher leave that morning, which was unusual because the sound of his Harley-Davidson starting up was distinctive and typically woke her around 6:30 in the morning each workday without fail. She had knocked on Christopher's door at 7:45 in the morning to check on him, but received no answer despite knocking repeatedly. Using her master key, Mrs. Murphy and the co-worker entered Christopher's apartment at 8:22 in the morning. What they found was deeply unsettling and raised immediate alarm. The apartment appeared normal at first glance. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing obviously missing that would indicate theft or violence. But Christopher's work clothes, which he typically laid out the night before for the next morning with military precision, were still neatly arranged on a chair untouched. His lunch pail, which he always prepared before bed as part of his routine, sat empty on the kitchen counter. Most tellingly, his wallet and keys were on the dresser in his bedroom. Items Christopher would never have left behind if he had gone somewhere voluntarily or planned. Mrs. Murphy immediately checked the garage behind the building where Christopher kept his prized Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The motorcycle was gone, leaving an empty space where it should have been. But this created more questions than it answered in everyone's minds. If Christopher had left on his motorcycle, why had he left his wallet and keys behind? How had he started the motorcycle without the key that was still sitting on his dresser? By 9 o'clock in the morning on August 15th, Betty Wilson had received a call at her office from Mrs. Murphy, who was increasingly alarmed by the mysterious circumstances. Betty immediately left work without hesitation and went to Christopher's apartment to see the situation herself. She confirmed that something was terribly wrong with growing dread. Christopher had plans to take her to dinner that evening, plans he had been excited about and had mentioned several times. He would never have simply disappeared without contacting her first. At 10:30 in the morning, Betty Wilson walked into the Gary Police Department and filed a missing persons report with shaking hands. The officer who took her report, Sergeant William McCarthy, noted the concerning details carefully, but also noted that Christopher was an adult man who had been gone less than 24 hours at that point. In 1953, police generally waited 48 hours before launching intensive investigations into missing adults, operating under the assumption that most missing persons returned on their own within a day or two. However, by August 16th, when Christopher still had not appeared anywhere and his family confirmed he had not contacted anyone, the Gary Police Department began a formal investigation into his disappearance. Detective James Sullivan was assigned to the case with instructions to investigate thoroughly. His investigation over the following weeks would establish a timeline, but ultimately produce no answers or leads. Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed that Christopher had been seen by multiple witnesses on the evening of August 14th. Mrs. Murphy had seen him arrive home at 3:50 in Twy-Boynthine, the afternoon looking normal. A neighbor, Mr. Thomas Anderson, had seen Christopher working on his motorcycle in the garage around 4:30 in the afternoon, as he often did after work to maintain the machine. Another neighbor reported hearing the Harley's distinctive engine sound around 7:15 in the evening, suggesting Christopher had either started the motorcycle himself or someone else had started it for unknown reasons. But after 7:15 in the evening on August 14th, Christopher Jones seemed to vanish into thin air without leaving any trace. No one reported seeing him riding his motorcycle through town on any of the usual routes. No one saw him at any of the local establishments he occasionally frequented for meals or supplies. His motorcycle club friends hadn't seen him at their usual meeting spots. Betty Wilson had expected him to call her that evening to confirm their dinner plans for the next night, but no call had come through. Detective Sullivan investigated every possible angle with thoroughness and dedication. He interviewed Christopher's co-workers extensively, who all described him as reliable and showed no indication of planning to leave his job or his life. He spoke with Christopher's family members, who were devastated and insisted that Christopher would never disappear voluntarily, especially without contacting his mother, whom he spoke with regularly. He questioned Betty Wilson extensively about their relationship, wondering if, perhaps, a romantic conflict had led Christopher to flee from his life. But Betty maintained that everything had been fine between them and that they were planning a future together. The investigation also looked into Christopher's finances carefully, checking whether he had withdrawn large amounts of money that might suggest planned flight or intention to start a new life elsewhere. His bank account showed no unusual activity whatsoever. His savings remained untouched and unaccessed. If Christopher had left voluntarily, he had done so with no money and no preparation at all. One theory that emerged during the investigation was that Christopher's war trauma had finally overwhelmed him, leading to some kind of mental breakdown or fugue state where he simply rode away without plan or purpose, lost in memories of combat. In 1953, post-traumatic stress disorder was poorly understood by the medical community, and veterans struggling with psychological wounds often received little help or sympathy from society. Some investigators suggested Christopher might have had a flashback or episode that caused him to flee from his life without conscious decision. Another theory focused on the possibility of foul play and criminal activity. Christopher's Harley-Davidson was valuable, worth several $100s in 1953, a significant sum of money that would motivate theft. Perhaps someone had wanted to steal the motorcycle and had killed Christopher in the process of the robbery. But this theory had problems that investigators couldn't resolve. Why would a thief leave behind Christopher's wallet with money still inside? Why was there no evidence of a struggle at the apartment or garage that would indicate violence? And most significantly, where was Christopher's body if he had been killed? Detective Sullivan also investigated whether Christopher might have been the victim of a crime unrelated to his motorcycle or possessions. Gary, Indiana, in 1953 was a rough industrial city with its share of violence and criminal activity. Perhaps Christopher had witnessed something he shouldn't have, or had gotten involved in something dangerous without realizing the consequences. But no evidence supported this theory, either despite extensive investigation. By October 1953, 2 months after Christopher's disappearance, the investigation had stalled completely with no new leads. The Gary Police Department had no leads, no body, no motorcycle, and no explanation for how a young man could simply cease to exist from the face of the earth. The case was officially classified as unsolved, though Detective Sullivan continued to check in on it periodically for several years, hoping for a breakthrough. Christopher's family never stopped searching for answers or hoping for his return. His mother, Dorothy, placed advertisements in newspapers across the Midwest, hoping someone had seen Christopher or his distinctive Harley-Davidson motorcycle somewhere. His father, Walter, drove through neighboring states on weekends, checking small towns and showing Christopher's photo to police departments and truck stop workers who might have seen him. Betty Wilson waited for years, hoping Christopher would contact her with an explanation, eventually moving on with her life, but never quite recovering from the mystery of his disappearance and the loss she felt. As the years passed relentlessly, Christopher Jones became one of many unsolved missing persons cases from the 1950s, a name in a file that occasionally got reviewed when similar cases came up, but ultimately remained an enigma without solution. By the 1970s, most people who remembered Christopher personally had moved away or passed away, taking their memories with them. By the 1990s, the case file had been transferred to storage, a relic of an era before computers, before DNA analysis, before the investigative tools that might have solved it decades earlier. The Gary Police Department never officially closed Christopher Jones's case, but as decades passed without new information or leads, the realistic hope of solving it faded to near zero in everyone's minds. His sister Margaret passed away in 1998, never knowing what happened to her brother she had loved. His parents both died in the 1980s, taking their grief and unanswered questions to their graves without closure. By 2024, 71 years after Christopher vanished, his case existed primarily in digitized archives, one of thousands of cold cases from mid-century America that would likely never be solved. No one was actively investigating his disappearance. No one expected it would ever be solved after so much time had passed. The era Christopher had lived in seemed impossibly distant, a time before interstate highways, before widespread television, before the modern world, that would eventually reveal what happened to him in the most unexpected way. The property at 847 Monroe Street in Gary, Indiana, had been abandoned for over 30 years when the city finally authorized its demolition in early 2024. The lot contained a deteriorating 2-story house and a detached garage, both built during the 1940s, according to construction records. The structures had been condemned in the 1990s after the owner died, and no heirs came forward to claim the property or maintain it. For decades, the buildings had sat vacant, becoming increasingly dilapidated and serving as occasional shelter for homeless individuals seeking refuge from the elements. The demolition contract was awarded to Midwest Demolition Services, a company based in Hammond, Indiana, with extensive experience in urban demolition projects. The project manager, Marcus Thompson, scheduled the work to begin on March 11, 2000. 24, with the garage slated for removal first, since it was the smaller structure and more severely deteriorated than the main house. On March 12th at 9:15 in the morning, excavator operator David Rodriguez began working on the garage demolition with standard equipment. The structure's concrete floor, typical of 1940s construction practices, was about 6 inches thick throughout most of the structure. David's initial work focused on breaking up this floor and removing it along with the garage's walls and roof without complications. By 10:30 in the morning, David had removed most of the structure and was working on clearing the site down to the original ground level for future development. But he noticed something unusual that caught his experienced eye. The concrete floor in one section of the garage, roughly 10 feet by 10 feet in dimensions, was significantly thicker than the rest of the floor. Rather than 6 inches, this section appeared to be several feet thick, and the concrete seemed to be of different composition, as if it had been poured at a different time with different materials. Curious about this anomaly that didn't make structural sense, David continued excavating carefully to investigate further. By 10:45 in the morning, he had removed approximately 3 feet of concrete and found that it continued deeper into the ground. At this point, Marcus Thompson came over to inspect the situation, wondering why progress had slowed on what should have been a straightforward demolition. Together, they examined the strange section of extra-thick concrete that defied normal construction practices. "This doesn't make sense at all," Marcus told David with confusion. "There's no reason to pour concrete this deep in a garage floor for any legitimate purpose. This is like someone was trying to bury something and hide it permanently." At 10:47 in the morning, when David's excavator bucket broke through the final layer of concrete at a depth of approximately 11 feet below the original garage floor level, they saw something that made both men stop immediately and step back. Encased in packed soil beneath all that concrete was an object wrapped in what appeared to be old tarpaulin, or canvas, that had partially deteriorated. The shape, even concealed by the wrapping, was unmistakable. It was a motorcycle buried deliberately. Marcus immediately called 911 to report the painful discovery. "You're going to think this sounds crazy," he told the dispatcher with urgency. "But we're doing a demolition, and we just found what looks like a motorcycle buried about 11 feet underground beneath a garage floor. This wasn't an accident or construction debris. Someone buried this intentionally and went to great lengths to hide it." Gary Police Department units arrived at the scene within 20 minutes of the call. Officers cordoned off the area with crime scene tape and contacted the Criminal Investigations Division immediately. Detective Lisa Martinez, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in major crimes, arrived at 11:30 in the morning and immediately recognized the significance of what had been found buried. "This is a crime scene that needs to be preserved," Detective Martinez told the demolition crew firmly. "We need to stop all work immediately and get forensic investigators out here as soon as possible. If someone went to this much trouble to hide a motorcycle under 11 feet of concrete, there's a story here, and probably not a good one that anyone wants to hear." By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a forensic recovery team had arrived and begun the painstaking process of excavating the motorcycle without damaging it or any potential evidence. The work took over 6 hours of careful, methodical excavation. As they carefully removed soil and debris with hand tools and brushes, the motorcycle emerged slowly, a vintage Harley-Davidson, its chrome tarnished, but its shape remarkably preserved by the concrete and soil that had encased it for decades. At 4:30 in the afternoon, forensic investigator Dr. Patricia Moore noted something that sent chills through everyone present at the excavation site. Alongside the motorcycle, also wrapped in deteriorating canvas that was falling apart, were items of clothing: a white t-shirt, denim jeans, and a leather jacket, all consistent with men's clothing from the 1950s era. And beneath the clothing, partially preserved by the same anaerobic conditions that had protected the motorcycle from complete decay, were human skeletal remains that changed everything about the investigation. The motorcycle's serial number was still visible despite decades underground, stamped on the engine casing where manufacturers placed them. Detective Martinez photographed it carefully and immediately began searching historical records and databases. By 6 o'clock in the evening, she had made the connection that would solve a 71-year-old mystery. The serial number matched a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead, reported missing in August 1953, along with its owner, Christopher Allen Jones, a 26-year-old veteran of the Korean War who had vanished without explanation. The 71-year-old mystery of Christopher Jones's disappearance had finally been solved through accidental discovery, but the finding raised even more disturbing questions that demanded answers. Who had killed Christopher Jones? Why had they gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide both his body and his motorcycle under so much concrete? Who had owned the property in 1953, and who had the access and resources to bury evidence 11 feet underground beneath a concrete garage floor without anyone noticing? The investigation into Christopher Jones's death, cold for 71 years, was suddenly very active again with renewed urgency. And the truth it would reveal would be far darker than anyone had imagined possible. The forensic recovery of Christopher Jones's remains and his Harley-Davidson motorcycle took 3 full days of painstaking work, from March 12th through March 14th, 2024. Every item, every fragment of bone, every piece of fabric was carefully documented, photographed, and preserved for analysis according to modern forensic protocols. The investigation was led by Detective Lisa Martinez, working closely with Dr. Patricia Moore from the Lake County Medical Examiner's Office and a team of forensic anthropologists from Indiana University who specialized in historical cases. The first critical question that needed answering was, who had owned the property at 847 Monroe Street in 1953? Detective Martinez pulled historical property records dating back to the 1940s from county archives. The findings were immediately significant and pointed toward a clear suspect. In August 1953, the property had been owned by a man named Vincent Russo, a 53-year-old who worked as a supervisor at United States Steel, the same plant where Christopher Jones had been employed as a machinist. Further investigation revealed that Vincent Russo had sold the Monroe Street property in November 1953, just 3 months after Christopher's disappearance, moving to Detroit, Michigan, in what appeared to be a hasty departure. Russo had died in 1987 at age 87, but Detective Martinez was able to locate his descendants through genealogical records. A grandson named Anthony Russo, who lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and might have information. On March 18th, Detective Martinez traveled to Ann Arbor to interview Anthony Russo about his grandfather's past. The conversation would prove crucial to understanding what had happened in 1953 all those years ago. Anthony, now 62 years old, had been just a teenager when his grandfather Vincent died. But he remembered stories his grandmother had told him about the family's sudden move from Gary to Detroit in 1953 that had always seemed mysterious. "My grandmother always said they left Gary because of trouble at the steel mill," Anthony told Detective Martinez, with concern in his voice. "She never went into details about what kind of trouble, but she made it clear that my grandfather had gotten involved in something he shouldn't have, and they needed to leave town quickly for their safety. She seemed scared when she talked about it, even decades later, when there was no apparent danger. Detective Martinez asked Anthony if his grandfather had ever mentioned Christopher Jones specifically, or any incidents from August 1953 that stood out. Anthony's response was chilling and confirmed suspicions. "I don't remember that specific name being mentioned, but my grandmother once told me, I must have been about 15 years old at the time, that my grandfather had done something terrible when he was younger that haunted him. She said he had hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and that guilt had eaten at him for the rest of his life like a cancer. She never gave me details about what he had done, but the way she said it with such sadness, it sounded like someone had died because of him." Armed with this information that pointed toward Vincent Russo's guilt, Detective Martinez returned to Gary and dove deeper into Vincent Russo's background and history. What she discovered painted a picture of a man with a violent temper and connections to organized crime that ran deep. Police records from the 1940s and 1950s showed that Russo had been questioned multiple times in connection with loan sharking operations that targeted steelworkers, had 2 arrests for assault that hadn't led to convictions due to witness intimidation, and was suspected of being an enforcer for illegal gambling operations in Gary's industrial neighborhoods where workers had money to lose. Meanwhile, Dr. Patricia Moore's forensic analysis of Christopher's skeletal remains revealed the cause of death with certainty: blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object like a pipe or hammer. The injuries showed signs of defensive wounds on Christopher's forearms, suggesting he had tried to protect himself during the attack and had fought for his life. The skeleton also showed a healed fracture of the left radius, consistent with Christopher's military medical records that documented a broken arm from a training accident in 1951 during his service. But the most revealing evidence came from analyzing the burial site itself with modern forensic techniques. Soil samples taken from various depths showed distinct layers with different compositions, indicating that the hole had been dug in stages over time rather than all at once. The motorcycle and Christopher's body had been placed in the hole first, then covered with about 3 feet of soil to conceal them. Then, remarkably, the concrete garage floor had been poured directly on top of everything, creating a sealed tomb 11 feet underground that was meant to hide the evidence forever. Construction records from 1953, painstakingly recovered from Gary's city archives that had been preserved, showed that Vincent Russo had obtained a permit to repair and reinforce garage foundation in September 1953, 1 month after Christopher's disappearance. The permit had been approved without inspection, not unusual in that era when building codes were less stringently enforced, allowing Russo to pour the concrete without any official oversight of what lay beneath the surface. Detective Martinez also discovered something significant in Christopher's employment: records from United States Steel that had been archived. In July 1953, 1 month before his death, Christopher had filed a formal complaint with plant management about Vincent Russo's illegal activities. The complaint, still preserved in the company's historical files, alleged that Russo was operating an illegal gambling operation among mill workers, pressuring employees to participate against their will, and threatening those who refused or couldn't pay their debts with violence. The complaint had been investigated by plant management according to protocol, but no action had been taken against Russo due to insufficient evidence and fear of retaliation. However, the complaint had been logged with Christopher's name as the reporting employee, meaning Russo would have known exactly who had tried to expose him and ruin his operation. This gave Russo clear motive for murder. The picture that emerged from all the evidence was clear and damning. Christopher Jones had stood up to a dangerous man, refusing to participate in illegal activities and reporting them to management despite the risks. Vincent Russo, a violent enforcer with everything to lose if his operation was exposed and he faced criminal charges, had killed Christopher in retaliation for threatening his livelihood. The murder had likely occurred at Russo's property, perhaps after luring Christopher there under false pretenses with some pretext. Russo had then used his own garage to create an elaborate grave, burying the body and the distinctive motorcycle so deep and so thoroughly that they would never be found by anyone. The timing of Russo's sudden sale of the property and move to Detroit in November 1953 now made perfect sense. He was fleeing before anyone could connect him to Christopher's disappearance and start asking difficult questions. He had gotten away with murder simply by moving to another state in an era before computerized databases, before interconnected law enforcement systems that shared information, before the kind of forensic investigation that would eventually expose his crime 7 decades later through modern science. On March 25, 2024, the Gary Police Department held a press conference to announce the resolution of the 71-year-old murder case that had finally been solved. Detective Lisa Martinez, flanked by Lake County Prosecutor Jennifer Williams and Dr. Patricia Moore, presented the findings of the investigation to a room filled with reporters, local historians, and members of Christopher Jones's surviving family who had waited decades for answers. Christopher Allen Jones was murdered in August 1953 by Vincent Russo, his supervisor at United States Steel. Detective Martinez announced to the assembled crowd. Christopher had filed a complaint about illegal gambling operations that Russo was running at the plant that victimized workers. In retaliation, Russo killed Christopher, buried his body along with his distinctive Harley-Davidson motorcycle under 11 feet of concrete in a garage he owned, and then fled to Michigan 3 months later to escape consequences. Russo died in 1987 without ever being held accountable for his crime. But today, 71 years later, we can finally give Christopher Jones's family the truth about what happened to him and why. The evidence presented at the press conference was comprehensive and damning beyond any reasonable doubt. Forensic analysis had definitively established that the remains were Christopher's, matched through DNA comparison with a distant cousin who still lived in Indiana and had volunteered samples. The cause of death, the timing of the concrete work, the property ownership records, Christopher's complaint against Russo, and Russo's sudden departure from Gary all combined to create an overwhelming case that left no room for alternative explanations. But because Vincent Russo had died in 1987, there would be no trial, no conviction, no legal justice for Christopher's murder in a courtroom. The case could only be officially closed, marked as solved, but with the perpetrator beyond the reach of the criminal justice system forever. Among those attending the press conference was Sarah Mitchell, Christopher's niece, the daughter of his younger brother Robert, who had passed away in 2019, never knowing what happened to his beloved brother. Sarah, now 68 years old, had grown up hearing stories about her Uncle Christopher, the war hero who had mysteriously vanished when her father was just 23 years old and starting his own life. "My father spent his entire life wondering what happened to his brother," Sarah told reporters through tears of mixed grief and relief. "He never gave up hope that someday we would know the truth about Christopher's disappearance. I only wish he had lived to see this day and have closure before he died. But at least now we know the truth, finally." Uncle Christopher didn't abandon his family like some people suggested. He didn't run away from his responsibilities or his life. He stood up against something wrong, and he paid the ultimate price for his courage and integrity. He was a hero in Korea, fighting for his country, and he was a hero in Gary, Indiana, standing against corruption. We can finally bring him home and lay him to rest with the dignity and honor he deserves. The discovery also answered questions that had haunted Gary's older residents for decades who remembered that era. Several people came forward after the press conference with memories of Vincent Russo and the fear he had generated in the 1950s among workers. A retired steel worker named James Patterson, now 92 years old, remembered being pressured by Russo to participate in gambling operations in 1952 when he was young. Everyone was afraid of Vince. Russo, back in those days, Patterson told reporters with conviction, if you didn't pay what you owed, or if you crossed him in any way, bad things happened to you. A couple of guys got beat up pretty badly for refusing to pay, and now we know that at least one person who stood up to him ended up dead and buried. I'm not surprised Christopher Jones tried to expose him. Christopher was that kind of man, brave and principled, and willing to do what was right. But I'm heartbroken that it cost him his life at such a young age. The investigation also revealed what had happened to Christopher's belongings and bank account after his death. Records showed that someone had accessed Christopher's apartment in September 1953. Likely Russo using keys taken from Christopher's body after the murder, and removed his possessions, which were never recovered or accounted for. The apartment had been cleaned out completely and re-rented by October 1953, with the EB landlady assuming Christopher had simply moved away without notice, which was not uncommon in that era. Betty Wilson, Christopher's girlfriend from 1953, was still alive in 2024, living in a nursing home in South Bend, Indiana, at age 95, and still sharp mentally. When Detective Martinez visited her to share the news about Christopher's discovery and the truth about what had happened, Betty wept with emotions she had kept buried for 7 decades. I waited for him for years after he disappeared, Betty said softly. Her memory of 1953 still remarkably clear, despite her advanced age and the passage of so much time. I always believed something terrible had happened to him because I knew Christopher. Christopher would never have left me without a word or explanation. He was kind, and he was honorable, and he loved me. And now I know I was right all along. He didn't leave me voluntarily. He was taken from us by violence and evil. I'm so grateful to finally know what happened after all these years, even if it's 71 years too late for us to have the life we planned together. The Harley-Davidson motorcycle, once Christopher's pride and joy, and symbol of his freedom, had survived remarkably well in its concrete tomb despite the decades. After being cleaned and preserved by forensic conservators using specialized techniques, it was placed in the Gary Historical Society's museum as part of an exhibit about Christopher Jones's life and the investigation that finally solved his murder. The exhibit included Christopher's military service records, photos from his time in Korea serving his country, images of him with his beloved motorcycle looking happy, and the story of how one man's courage in standing up to corruption cost him everything he had and everything he would ever have. Christopher Allen Jones was finally laid to rest on April 15, 2024, at Oak Hill Cemetery in Gary, Indiana, 70 years and 8 months after his death at the hands of a killer. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, including surviving family members who had never stopped hoping for answers, Korean War veterans who came to honor one of their own, members of local motorcycle clubs who paid tribute to a fallen rider, and Gary residents who wanted to honor a man who had stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. His headstone, paid for by donations from the Gary community who were moved by his story, reads, Christopher Allen Jones, 1927 to 1953. Korean War veteran, murdered for his courage, finally home. The case of Christopher Allen Jones stands as one of the most remarkable examples of how modern forensic science and persistent investigation can solve even the coldest of cases that seem impossible. What made this case particularly extraordinary was not just the 7 decades that passed before its resolution, but the extreme measures taken to conceal the crime. Measures that ultimately preserved the evidence that would expose the truth in ways the killer never could have imagined. The 11 feet of concrete that Vincent Russo poured over Christopher's grave in 1953, intended to hide his crime forever and ensure it would never be discovered, ironically created the perfect preservation conditions for evidence. The anaerobic environment prevented decomposition that would have destroyed skeletal evidence over time, and the sealed tomb protected both the body and the motorcycle from the elements that would have scattered or destroyed evidence in a shallow grave exposed to weather and animals. The case also highlighted how dramatically investigative capabilities have evolved since 1953 and the limitations of that era. Detective James Sullivan, who investigated Christopher's disappearance in the 1950s, had no access to DNA analysis that could identify remains, no computerized databases connecting crimes across jurisdictions and states, no forensic anthropology techniques that could determine cause of death from skeletal remains decades old with precision. He did his best with the tools available at the time, but the murder would have remained unsolved without the accidental discovery in 2024, and the modern forensic methods applied to the evidence that technology made possible. Christopher Jones's story serves as a powerful reminder about the price of integrity in a corrupt world. In 1953, standing up to workplace corruption and organized crime required extraordinary courage, especially for a young veteran still dealing with war trauma and trying to build a stable life in difficult circumstances. Christopher could have looked the other way and ignored what he saw, could have participated in Russo's gambling operations to avoid making waves, could have stayed silent about illegal activity to protect himself. Instead, he chose to do what was right, filing an official complaint even though he must have known it would make him a target for retaliation by dangerous people. His murder also illustrates how criminals often evade justice not through sophisticated planning but through geographic mobility and the limitations of era-specific law enforcement that couldn't track people across state lines. Russo didn't outsmart investigators with clever schemes. He simply moved to another state before anyone suspected him of involvement. In an era when state police departments rarely coordinated their investigations and criminal records didn't follow people across state lines automatically. For Christopher's family, the discovery brought painful closure after 71 years of not knowing. Sarah Mitchell and other surviving relatives could finally honor Christopher properly with a real burial, understand that he hadn't abandoned them, as some had wondered, and recognize that his disappearance was the result of his courage rather than any failing on his part or desire to escape his life. Betty Wilson, at 95 years old, finally received confirmation of what she had always believed in her heart, that the man she loved would never have left her voluntarily, that something terrible had happened to prevent him from building the life they had planned together. The 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead, Christopher's beloved motorcycle that represented freedom to him, found permanent home in the Gary Historical Society Museum, where visitors can see it. Restored and preserved with care, it stands as a memorial not just to Christopher, but to all who have paid the ultimate price for refusing to compromise their principles in the face of corruption and evil. The motorcycle that once represented Christopher's freedom and escape from war trauma became, in death, a monument to his integrity and the cost of doing what is right. Today, the Christopher Jones case is taught in forensic science programs across the country as an example of how construction and demolition projects can unexpectedly uncover evidence from decades-old crimes that were thought to be perfectly hidden. It's also studied in criminal justice courses as a case study in how organized crime operated in mid-century industrial America and how whistleblowers faced retaliation with little legal protection or support from authorities. The Gary Police Department officially closed Christopher's case on April 30, 2024, marking it as solved deceased suspect in their records. While Vincent Russo would never face trial for his crime or answer for what he had done, the truth was finally known, recorded, and preserved for history. Christopher Allen Jones, Korean War veteran, murdered at age 26 for standing up to corruption, was no longer a mystery or a cold case statistic, gathering dust in archives. He was a hero whose story would be remembered and honored by future generations. The empty lot at 847 Monroe Street, where Christopher's body lay hidden for 71 years beneath concrete and soil, is now marked with a memorial plaque installed by the city of Gary to honor his memory. It reads, "On this site, Christopher Allen Jones, 1927 to 1953, was found in 2024. A veteran who served his country in Korea and died standing against corruption. May his courage never be forgotten." The story of Christopher Allen Jones reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing eventually. It reminds us that courage has consequences, sometimes terrible ones, but that standing up for what is right matters even when the cost is high. And it reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed by decades, can still be achieved through the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain forgotten, and the advancement of science that makes the impossible possible. Christopher Jones never got to live the life he deserved, never got to marry Betty Wilson, never got to raise children or grow old watching his Harley-Davidson become a cherished vintage classic. But his story lives on as a testament to integrity, courage, and the truth that time cannot erase. In the end, 71 years later, Christopher Jones came home, and the world finally knew what happened to a young veteran who dared to stand against corruption and paid the ultimate price for his bravery.